Today's lecture is eligible for continuing education credits for both the AIA and the US GBC through a self-reporting system. I think the directions are somewhere around, probably on your seat as well. This lecture is being recorded and you will be able to reference it through the facilities planning website in the future. So, which brings me to the last part of me being up here. I have the pleasure of introducing Bruce Coldham, an architect and an advocate for high-performance green buildings. Bruce is originally from Australia, or at least that's what I deduced from your accent. He came to the US almost 30 years ago and has for the past 22 years run his own architectural practice out of Amherst, Massachusetts. And his practice is dedicated to producing beautiful and efficient buildings. Bruce is an active member of the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association, which we all know as NESEA, and he has actually chaired the very influential and renowned the Building Energy Conference 3 times. He was an active member of Governor Deval Patrick's Zero Energy Building Task Force, and is currently a member of the Massachusetts Zero and Net Energy Building Advisory Council. Today, Bruce will be speaking about the Living Building Challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. While Lawson's doing that, I'm going to talk about the Living Building Challenge. I'll use the mic, but sometimes I like to wander around, so if that's okay, I'll try it occasionally, and if people can't hear me, then say so. And I think we'll leave the lights on, at least for the first part. How many people here, I want to find out who I'm speaking to, because it's not exactly clear what the mix of students, what the mix of professionals is. So how many people here have heard about this Living Building Challenge? So it looks like a fair slice. And of you, how many, say, are professionals in whether it be engineering, architects, or what have you? So a few, and I would conclude that the remainder are students. Or okay. I've come prepared to talk about my experience actually doing this. I think I'm still going to do that to the extent that I'm being a little too technical. Just pull the chain or something like that, and I can back off to some degree. But if I'm not being technical enough, you can try me. I should give you my perspective here to begin with. I'm going to be talking about my personal experience, or our personal experience, Coldham and Hartman's personal experience. We're, by the way, a firm of about 6 or 8 people. We're in town here. We work all over New England. We have a record of doing high-performance buildings, and this Living Building Challenge interested us. We are midway, maybe not midway. We are well underway with a project for Smith College, their Bechtel Environmental Classroom project. So I'm speaking to you as an architect, which is to say a design professional, not an owner, and not a constructor, although the 3 at least representative Scapes builders, who are the constructor for this project, are in the audience. And as I think you'll find as we proceed here, this is a highly integrated commitment between owner, constructor, and the design team. So I'm looking through the design team window. I'm not an owner. Some things that I say may will be affected by that. If I was an owner, I might see this a little differently. Also, we are under construction by about a month and a half of this project. So it's a bit like a check-in in a marathon, you know. I've gone 6 or 8 miles, and you're asking me or I'm asking myself how I feel. How am I doing so far? I don't even know whether I've hit the wall. I don't even know whether there is a wall. Feels like I'm already hitting the wall, and feels like I'm about to topple over it. I could wait a year, and typically our firm does wait quite a while before we discuss these things because we like to discuss from the experience of having done something, not speculating on what might happen. We don't like to speculate, for example, on performance based on theoretical modeling. We like to discuss and report on our buildings based on measured data. But in this instance, the process of doing this is sufficiently interesting and unusual, and the whole thing takes a good long while because the Living Building Challenge requires reporting, not arm waving. In other words, it's not based on theoretical modeling. You are successful or not based on the measured performance of your building product. That means it's going to take a few years. So after a few years, I'm not going to have as clear a recollection of what the first 6 miles are like. So I'm interested and was interested in talking about this from that perspective. But I think it's important that you understand that I'm not Jason McClellan. I didn't invent this thing. I'm not Flansburgh, who've successfully executed a project in Hawaii. There's only a few, maybe 4 or 5 firms that have, and I'm not among them yet. I hope to be. So that's the perspective. I think the place for me to start, and it's the place I did start when we were thinking about this. I have known Jason for quite a while. Jason McClellan is now the director of the the ILBI, the International Living Building Institute, and was essentially the champion that created this project. He used to work with Bob Berkebile and BNIM. He and Bob and others, including Pliny Fisk and a few folks that you may know, had a project in Montana in the late 90s for the university at, I think it was Bozeman. And this idea for a living building challenge came out of that project, which was not built. But the aspirations they had, which was probably part of the reason why it wasn't built, I'm guessing there, I don't know that, was what triggered this. The idea, well, you know, our idea was great. We didn't get it executed in Montana, but it should be executed. And Jason eventually, years later, created this Living Building Challenge with others. But he's the champion. We started thinking about this, whereas we hadn't really committed to any lead projects. And I wanted to think about it from that point of view for a moment. The Living Building Challenge is not lead. It really isn't. We, in our office, have had many discussions with clients about the LEED program. Does everybody know what the LEED thing is? What is it? The USGBC. All these initials get me. I'm getting beyond being able to put them all together in words. But it's one of these formative rating systems. We began to think about rating, well, not me really, but the folks that I know well and have been influenced by considerably over the years began to be thinking about these rating systems in the late 80s, early 90s, when the arm waving around sustainable and ecological and energy conscious and all of that just got a little bit too much. I think that was even before green came around. Green pretty much arrived around the same time as rating systems to rate green. And they started, I think, with the Building Research Establishment in north of London and the BREEAM program, but others bloomed in Canada and New Zealand and other places. And in this country, it was the leadership of USGBC and LEED that was became the market transformation tool. And that's what it is. It's a market transformation. The Living Building Challenge really is directed rather specifically project by project at regulatory agencies, at manufacturers, at design teams, at owners, and presents a formative challenge. Let's see, I'll wait on that a little bit. essentially, the difference between LEED and the Living Building Challenge is that whereas LEED is like a menu that you would go into, you'd be familiar with it in a restaurant. Living Building Challenge is more like what you might call a table d'hôte. At least that's what my mother would have called it. You arrive at somebody's house and you get to eat what's on the table. You don't get to choose. It's laid out there. You can choose. You can say, "I'm sorry. I think I'm going to leave and continue on the road. I'm not going to have dinner with you tonight." But the Living Building Challenges offers a meal, and you have to have a huge appetite. LEED allows you to pick. You can take hors d'oeuvres and go, or you can take the whole meal and you can take it in various orders and you can have different things and you can build up points progressively to a total. The Living Building Challenge is 20 imperatives and you need to fulfill all of them to fulfill the challenge. It's an all or nothing deal. It's a bit like being on a diving board. You get to jump spectacularly, land or not, or you can walk back along the board and you can climb back down the ladder. That's essentially the options. When we've been talking to our clients about LEED, we were often looking for what we called the brand value. Was it worth it? And typically our clients found that the galvanizing effect of a LEED rating on the design team, or whether the owner needed it, or all sorts of things, it wasn't strong enough to fulfill the 60,000 odd, more or less, that you would be paying for that if you were pursuing a LEED program, a LEED certification. There are costs embedded in LEED, and I haven't done it, so again, I'm speaking from a limited amount of personal experience. But it, for example, does or did, I'm sure it still does, involve a fairly expensive energy modeling. And you have to commit to buying that. That's not an issue with the living building. There's no point, I mean, you can choose to do it if you like, but the model is not what counts. It's the end building that counts. So the costs are different as well. The brand value is different and the costs are different. So what I want to do now is briefly describe what the living building, I think this thing is losing elevation every now and again. Here we go. On your seat, you've got a handout which I tried to put in the simplest, clearest sentence a description of what each of these imperatives was or is. So, okay, why bother? There shouldn't be a question mark there, actually. I realized that from my point of view, I'm explaining why I bothered, not questioning why you should bother. That's my... So as I've explained, it's a consequential challenge. It's not LEED. It really is a tough challenge. And for us, the brand value is worth the effort, we think. It's extensive, exacting, it's tough, and it transforms our thinking. It's all in, it's not LEED. There are 20 of these imperatives. They're organized rather cutely, I think, into what they call petals. But that's fine. I mean, petals works, I guess. Site, water, energy, materials, they bear some resemblance to LEED. But when you get into equity, beauty, that's left the LEED program behind to some degree. We'll start here with this. This is essentially number 1, according to their numbering. Limits to growth. And I want to be sure that I get my... So essentially, this requires that the project not be built on a green field. And we would have thought that for the project that we're doing for Smith, this would have been a disqualifier right out of the gate. I'll explain why it's not in a minute, but essentially there are exemptions and qualifiers within these imperatives. They're tough, but there's a balance that exists between a tough standard and a recognition of engagement, because ultimately the challenge, or the Living Building Institute, are trying to affect at a more specific level the world around them. So that unlike LEED, for example, it doesn't have a board or a group of trade-related consensus operating industry representatives that establish the terms of these imperatives. They're established by Jason and his carefully selected cohorts. So it's a higher standard, but nonetheless, there's a recognition that you have to have a standard that's pitched appropriately so that people will want to respond to it, because if it's too tough and no one wants to respond to it, it's not going to have the level of positive benefit that they're intending. If it's too easy, it's not going to have the level of positive benefit. And it's intended to be more demanding than LEED because LEED already exists. And the Living Building Challenge is a push beyond and well beyond that, but not beyond the point of rationality. The UA is urban agriculture, and this imperative recognizes the importance of food production and wants to fold food production into projects. It folds it in more energetically in the smaller scale, less dense projects, and less so in urban, in denser urban areas. HE is the habitat exchange, and that is fairly simple. That there's a purchased and committed conservation land, or land that's put into a permanent habitat in exchange for whatever development is done in the site that in question. Car-free living is one that I don't understand too well, because our projects are in what is called the transects. Well, they have. I guess I should explain that now. The transect from 1 to 6 is a density gradient, and our projects are in the transects 2 and 3, which are essentially at the scale of rural village. Transect 6, I think, is an urban density. The car-free living imperatives operate more strenuously when you get into the more dense transects. Net zero water is pretty much what it says. Well, actually, it isn't.
No.
It intends that there be a closed loop in the water supply. We've explored what that means, and I'll get back to that later too, because some of our learning so far have been pushing the Living Building Institute on what does it mean. The sense that one gets from the projects to date is that one wants to collect water from the roof, store it, and that you have a very tight closed loop. That we pushed them to some degree to understand what an appropriate closed loop is, what it means, and whether or not it's beneficial or appropriate or intelligent to be storing water in concrete bunkers when you could store it in the ground. A concrete bunker has a higher energy investment necessary in treating that water that's been stored in a dead environment. So our sense is that the ground is a better place to store it, and that conversation is one that I'll elaborate on later if we have time. The ecological water flow is the reciprocal of that. The water leaving the building needs to be managed in a way that recharges the aquifers and does so without a pollutant load. Net zero energy, fairly straightforward, and that one is fairly straightforward. Our office has done has done or is in the process of doing half a dozen of these buildings. I know that at NESEA some years ago we started a net zero building award, and 4 years ago we couldn't get any entries. Now we can, and Simi has been deeply involved in that. So that world is changing. Civilized environment and healthy air are relating to they're relatively straightforward, I think, relative to some of these. Having windows that operate, having ventilation systems that maintain healthy air mechanically. Biophilia is B. That's a mystery to me. It's not. It is and it isn't. I've sat through. I know Stephen Kellett. I have asked Judith H. with the unpronounceable Dutch name from the northeast to northwest to speak at NESEA a couple of times. Very thoughtful, intelligent people, and the process of or the notion that buildings ought to have a life, a light connection with life. In concept, is easy to understand. What I don't understand is what the metric and the method for formally incorporating it in a building in a way that will get past the muster. It's very interesting to me that on the dialogue, which I'll get to in a minute, there have been 4 years been no postings on Biopedia. In fact, last night I was explaining this, I think, in preparation for this talk, and I thought, God damn it. So I went on, I opened up, I did a posting, I said, is everybody else really clear about this? Am I the only guy that seems to be confused? Is there a whole discussion going on somewhere else that I'm not aware of? And then I signed off. So I'm going to check back in a week and see what happens. But as you can see, that's there are an array of approaches here, or at least. This is the material section, the red list, embodied carbon footprint, responsible industry, appropriate sourcing, and conservation and reuse. I'm going to talk about these later, but particularly this red list, which is this. There's 14, I think, minerals, elements, compounds, and this is what the ILDI don't want to see in anything in the building, whether it's a roofing material, an insulation product, or whether it's a piece of mechanical equipment, or a weeny piece of tape that I'm about to seal 2 pieces of wood with, a gasket, a sealant, a paint, the concrete. Concrete's got mercury in it. It's a naturally occurring material, so you get confused with these things. Is that okay or not? So that's the red list. More later on that. Responsible industry is essentially at this stage a requirement for FSC lumber. It will ideally and notionally have similar requirements for other extractive industries, but there's no FSC equivalent for steel or iron or those kind of metals in mining, or extractive fuels like oil and so forth and gas. So it's there, and it specifically at the moment applies to sourcing of lumber, but it's still a big deal. Appropriate sourcing has to do with a set of concentric radii around your site and zones going out from 1 to 5, from which you must source certain components, and it's organized by the CSI specification. The CSI is the Construction Specifications Institute, and for those of you who are not in the industry yet, there is a really elaborate 6-digit classification system for pretty much everything that you can ever imagine would be in a building. And they use that system for deciding whether or not you should be sourcing your material from 500 miles. Sorry, they use kilometers, which is, I think, very cool. Having grown up in the system that we have here in Australia, then changing for 10 years, and then coming back to this, it's really a brutal experience. So I'm glad to see kilometers as existing, or maybe in our lexicon at least a little bit. So 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 are the radii. And you can get ideas from some notional, what is it, 13 or 26,000 kilometer, and it turns out to be half the diameter of the world, which is a clever way, I guess, of saying you can get it from anywhere. I'll come back to those in a bit, because this is where I am right now in my process. These are vaguer, and the metrics are less, more difficult to establish. But HS and HP is human scale and human places. Democracy and social justice, is that what it is, or have I got the D word right? But it's essentially it boils down to, at this point, it seems to be access and so forth, non-discrimination through building design. And what we have in this country with our access laws, we are actually, I think, in a better situation than most countries. Certainly, we cite Europe a lot in terms of, and I will, in terms of its the way in which it's organizing environmentally and ecologically its building materials. They're way ahead of us, but they're not ahead of us when it comes to access. You can see some really hokey arrangements that poses access that would make the people at the AEB in Boston laugh before they cry. Rights to nature. If you own a beachfront, you have to share it. It's that kind of thing. Beauty and spirit, and inspiration and education. It's expected that these buildings will engage you at an aesthetic and spiritual level. I think that's the aspiration of all architects, so it shouldn't be a surprise. Inspiration and education is the same kind of thing, I would say, from the owner's side. The sense is that we share the data we get, we share the learnings from the building, we use the project as an inspirational example, and there are mechanisms for communicating that. So that's the tour. This is another way of, some of you have probably seen that map of the world that people map things in different ways, and this is a map of how onerous I think those diagrams are, those bubbles are. Same bubbles, I just diagrammed them according to how fearful I am. And I've colored them a little bit too. Where there is blue, the lead responsibility is with the owner. The user behavior is the orange. There's a little bit here in net zero energy and a lot in net zero water and the conservation and reuse. We'll be successful in these two to a very large extent on how the owner and the people in the building, which is not really the owner in this case. The owner can wave their arms and say, Smith College can say, be careful, turn off the tap, turn off the lights, but it's the departments and the students who are in there that will make that happen or not. It's one of the things that I like so much about this program, or this challenge. It enfolds a bigger spread than LEED does by far, and largely because it asks for performance data as the validating metric, not theoretical modeling. You don't get to put in a plug load in here and say that's it. The so-called plug loads, which are the things that are powering this and the computer and that guy there and the lights and the toasters and the coffee makers and the computers and endlessly, are the most complex loads in the building to control. If you randomly estimate a plug load and move on, you really haven't gone very far towards engaging the humans in the building. Living Building Challenge absolutely does. And one of the things that I'm kind of observing, I think, well, not observing, imagining, yet to be observed about this, is that if we do a really good job, we are going to be challenged further by the fact that there'll be more people in there, doing more things, spending more time there, and it'll be more difficult to demonstrate zero in these things. I think that's what you might call an occupational hazard of these projects. There haven't been that many of them done, so we don't know that. I've got design cleverness. I don't know whether that's the right word, but basically there are challenges of the design team are the green, and the team tenacity is and these are the areas where team tenacity is required, and which I thought I would speak a little bit about. Simi, when should I plan to end this? I'm sorry, I should have asked you that. In about 20 minutes?
5:15.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, we'll try for 20, and I'll see if because I'd like to talk about this with you a little. The red list is the big distinguishing thing in this challenge, the idea that there are prescribed materials and what that means. And what that means to me, well, I think I'll move through that. I've got some diagrams, we'll better describe that later. So Here's my diagram of my fear. These are what allays that. This dialogue process is essentially the feedback mechanism. And this is another thing that I like about this challenge, is that it's got a wonderfully engaged feedback mechanism. It's really the way that it's the life process for the Living Building Challenge. Anybody who's involved in this can log in to, and should and does, you pay your membership and you get access behind the veil of their website, and there is this thing called a dialogue, and you post questions, and the ILBI answer them. Others do as well involved. There is a record of the conversation. It's essentially the mechanism by which the program is refined, and by which interpretations are given, so that you have some sense about whether you're likely to be successful in 2 years. And that's very important, because unlike LEAD, if you blow off your bike rack point and you've still got your other 30 points or whatever it is, here, and you get something, or you say, gosh, I guess we didn't get the bike rack point, we're going to have to go after something else. Here, really, I feel, anyway, there is a sense that everything's at stake all the time. Because if we don't successfully complete one of these imperatives, it will, to a high degree, invalidate our success on the others, because we won't get this badge. It's as I said, an all or nothing thing. That's a kind of onerous position. It feels a bit unreasonable, and I don't know whether I'm just being a little too sensitive here about it. But as I said, this is a 6 mile bit. Right at 6 miles, I'm feeling a little vulnerable. But it is a good feedback process. It's the record of your exchange. And there are accommodations or exceptions. In the case of appropriate sourcing, if you find that you have a material that is close, but it has a red-listed component in it, let's take lumber, engineered lumber, those kind of parallel-stranded LVLs, all of those kind of things. In the Northeast, it turns out that's a really difficult thing, because the LVL strands on these come typically the closest from Louisiana, and otherwise the West Coast. If you're looking for FSC, that's as far as you have to go. Formaldehyde, though, is a component in the mix. So how important is getting rid of the formaldehyde versus getting FSC sourcing versus getting the lumber from 1,500 miles? When you've got trade-offs, how do you work all that out? And the conversation or the thought process that you use to work all that out in your particular case is conducted, or should be, in this dialogue. And that is helpful, because it gives you some sense that it's that you are safely, that you're making good decisions. But also, as I said, is the record of growth and feedback for the whole program. This is a dedicated diagram to the spread of responsibility, which was given in color-coded form on the other diagram, but is more clearly noted here. I'm going to show you just a couple of slides of the interface, because I know that when I was contemplating this, it would have been helpful for me to know a little bit just what the feeling of the engagement process might be. Maybe that's because I'm 65 and web-related behavior is not something that comes as naturally to me as it probably does to you, Simi, or others who are sitting behind you. So here we are. Is the website. You choose community, and in the community there are choices of the dialogue, which I've mentioned. You can get the user guide here. There's a thing called the Brains Trust, which I don't think is really up and going too much yet, but it's intended that successful projects will share. And then across, if you push on either of those, these are the so-called petals. So here, for example, is the materials, and so now I'm going to go to the materials. Well, actually, no, I'm here on water. So here's what happens. Someone has posted a question, and here is the answer that says ILBI staff. And as I said, we were interested in this water business because we had thought that we would try and catch the water on the roof because that's what we thought a closed loop meant. And we found out, and part of the challenge here is to not only push manufacturers to changing their manufacturing processes, but also to push regulators to accommodate regulatorily. How can you accommodate a roof catchment system? Well, we ended up with 6 of us and 6 of the Department of Environmental Protection and Drinking Water Program people in Springfield in the room. We spent 2.5 hours there, and we came out with a general sense that was initiated by them that we could permit this roof water catchment system as a reservoir. They hadn't permitted a reservoir in years, but they were up for it, they thought, at least in principle they were. And so we thought, wow, this is cool. We've actually managed to move the ball forward, maybe, in the regulatory environment to do something that they had never done before. Now, as I said earlier, we then proceeded from that to imagine, well, why would we do that? But the point was that we had that conversation, and that's what this challenge is trying to do multiple times on multiple projects. We eventually then trolled the dialogue because we wanted to find out whether there was a better alternative. When my plumbing engineer said, why do you want to store water in a dead tank? It doesn't seem like a good idea, and you know how much energy you're going to spend in purifying it. So these were the part of the postings that I looked at to see whether a well was acceptable. Well, what we did was we reduced our water demand, or we organized our water demand, I should say, so that we had no non-potable water. We got rid of all of that. We use composting toilets, so we have no toilet flows. We have no irrigation. We have no cooling or mechanical water requirements. We have one tap that's a janitorial sink, and that's on the line as to whether that's a potable water. My plumbing engineer says, I can show you a regulation that says it has to be potable. I said to him, well, I suppose I could challenge that regulation, but I don't want to. We've also reduced our water demand handsomely, at least on paper. So the ILBI recognized that a closed loop can be a well. We started with a shallow well, and then we thought, well, shallow wells are more vulnerable. Can we do it a deep well? And they, I think, kind of felt the nose of the camel coming under the tent, you know, as we went from roof to shallow to deep, and they're kind of thinking, what kind of artesian geyser are we really going to end up with? But our dialogue with them has a record of that. And we know what we need to do to satisfy them, we think. Moving on. The red list that I mentioned requires us to write letters. We write a lot of letters. Well, actually, we do a lot of talking. I must have had 100, well, more than that, and probably will have 10, well, 3 or 4 times that before I'm done, with people in technical support of various manufacturing companies all over the place, wanting them to tell me what is in their products. And then when they tell me, I want them to tell me on a letter with their letterhead. It's quite interesting what happens between the first conversation and the second conversation. But the fact of the matter is that we get our letters. I send them this letter, which is really a prompt that says, so it makes it easier for them. It's got the red list there, and it's got the distance requirements. And I want them to confirm in relation to a given material, and this one's going to Atlas Roofing, I think, that this particular material is red list free, and it comes from a certain distance. And sometimes you need to be concerned that the raw materials are also within that radius, and other times it's not so important, or it's not important. So it's intriguing. In this case, halogenated flame retardants are in this product. even though it's the greenest insulation. Same with ESPS. I thought I could get packaging, EPS type 9, that higher density EPS foam, but they stopped doing that. I can't even, because I thought, well, under a slab, that's where we use this now a lot. Who cares? Well, not who cares, but can I make the case that a building regulatory official should not care or doesn't need to care about a flame retardant in a EPS that's below a slab? And I thought I could make that argument, but it turns out that there's no point in making the argument because what I thought was available a few years ago is no longer available. All EPS, at least as far as I'm aware at this point, all PEPS has brominated flame retardants in it. I checked the other night, and you can too, the REACH Accord. I don't know if it's a accord, a program, a protocol, whatever. It's the European Union's protocol on mitigating the toxic impacts of chemicals. And if you Google REACH, just R-E-A-C-H, it's amazing. That's all you get. I thought, I'll give it a shot. It was promulgated about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's had a hell of an effect in Europe. We asked Zender for their ComfoAir, which is a heat recovery ventilator. Their whole product is absent red listed materials, the whole damn product. Typically, we expect with those complex pieces of mechanical equipment that we will be inevitably invoking what's called the small component exception. This is one of the accommodations that I mentioned, that you can get a small component exemption because without it, nothing would be eligible at the scale of complex pieces of equipment. In Europe, that's not true. They've gotten to the point where these things are being stripped out of even their more complicated, more complex building components. This is a diagram that just shows the process. You register the project. That's a formal thing that one does at the beginning, which I think is important because it's a signal to the world that you've made the commitment. In the case of Smith College, after the trustees had thought the thing through and had given it its blessing, there was a press release. Once the press release was out, there was a fair number of Smith alumni that were doing rah-rah. So that's great, because that now means the college is enfolded in this to a high degree. At least I think to a high degree. I hope I'm not wrong. Peter Gagnon's here, or I don't think Charlie is. But the college really has made a commitment. And I guess if I was Charlie Conant, who's the project owner's representative, Charlie would say at this point, the Living Building Challenge is a goal, but it's not a requirement. And that's not backpedaling. It basically means that he's not going to sacrifice the project for the challenge, but short of that, it's all they want to do. There is a sequence of auditing, which I can't speak with any great authority on because that's a year or two off. But I can show you the documentary requirements, or at least the beginning of same. There's a 13-page document which they have put out, which makes it, I think, easy for you, or easier for me to understand what's required. So for each of these imperatives, there is a list of what's required. But first, here again is that blue, yellow, what have you, the sense that different teams or different components of the project, different parties are responsible or will lead in different places. Again, it's intended to spread the load, and I think rather more differently than lead. The lead protocols on materials are very demanding of the contractor. In this project, because it was a bid project, I tried to persuade Smith not to do that because I thought it was really going to make it difficult for us to get into this vetting with the contractor. We wanted them on much earlier. That didn't happen. But still, we, Coldham and Hartman, my firm, we committed to doing all of the material vetting. And Escapes is helping us with that, God bless them. But because we had to bid this project, the way I wrote the spec was, if you use the material that is specified, you can assume that it has been vetted, or if not, that it is the responsibility of the architect and not yours to do it. If you want to make a substitution, the vetting responsibility will be yours. And that was necessary to be able to get a price or a bidding process that wasn't going to be totally chaotic. But it meant that we essentially shifted the responsibility for one of the largest loads from the contractor primarily to the architect and design team primarily. And because depending on how persuasive I am with my consultants, it'll be mostly us. And if it's mostly us, it's mostly me. So here's, you're not going to be able to read that necessarily, but let's say in the imperative number 5, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 things that you need to provide. And water bills from a continuous 12-month period, if the project is not connected to a utility and therefore has no water bills, the project owner must write and sign a letter substantiating that this is the case. The fact that there is a mention of a utility suggests a certain level of, I don't know whether it's ambivalence or inconsistency or some word or phrase like that this thing is working itself out. But that doesn't mean that it isn't worthy. In fact, by my standards, that's terrific. I've been confronting regulatory agencies, if you've ever been to Maine, for example, where there is no feedback mechanism, and the strangest and most depressing things happen with regulators telling you that you have to do something, and they are recognizing that it's a nutty thing, but there's no mechanism for them to say you can do otherwise. One reason why I'm such a fan of feedback loops. So just to finish up then, there are a number of projects that have completed, about 5 I think at this point, and I'll show these only because if you happen to have High Performance Buildings magazine, many of them are in there. This is the Tyson Center in the University of Washington in Missouri. You'll notice that they're all fairly small buildings. You could think about why that might be the case. This is the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck. This was perhaps the first. BNIM, Bob Berkowal's company, did this building for the Omega Institute. It's essentially a wastewater treatment facility with a classroom, and they call it the Center for Sustainable Living. That wasn't meant to be disparaging, it was purely descriptive. I mean, I've got unbounded admiration for anybody that's gone through this program. Please don't misunderstand me. This is in Hawaii. That's interesting, huh? I mean, you've got your 5,000-mile Zone 5 radius and all of the diamonds in between, and what you got? You could build your building out of fish and coral, but that's about it. You'd have to talk to Flansburgh about how they managed this one. This is beyond me. This is not yet completed, but I've put it in there as an aspirational one. This is the Bullitt Foundation Cascadia Center. This hopes to be the home of the ILBI. Miller Hull are the architects. So some of these buildings are larger, but they're not done yet. This is our project. The site is up here. You can see that it's a green field. I said I would talk about why a green field can not be a green field. There is an exemption for projects that are fully engaged in interpretive or teaching in a nature reserve, and that's the exemption which we hope, and I guess we should say expect, to engage. There is a conversation around that we've had with them, so the expectation is reasonable or real. This area here is a fairly depressed site, really. It's a kind of a grey field, as grey a field as you can get in a natural setting. It was boulders were thrown there by the farmers. It's a real boulder dump. It was rather unsympathetically logged about 30 years ago. There are all kind of invasive species and so forth that have grown back in there. It's a kind of a messy place. It also happens to be a very nice place for the building, so that was fortunate. But essentially, we are keeping the existing parking under the trees there that was set up for this observatory. This site was created or purchased by Smith 50 years ago to relocate the observatory off campus because Smith wanted to use the observatory site on campus for some wonderful project, and this was the quid pro quo. This is what it looks like right now. I'm standing on a big pile of earth right there, and I'm panning from there all up to there. Oops. No, I'm not. Fooled you. And, oh, that's a slide that is... So, Lawson, what have I, in the minute that's remaining before my proposed ending at 5, I just want to scroll through this thing called Taking Root, which I got today. It occurred to me that somebody would ask me how many projects are completed, how many are in process, and so forth. And so I called them, and they pointed me to this, which is on their website. Their website, you know, you don't know everything everywhere. This is on the public side, so but it's called Taking Root, and it shows that we have. This is the Omega project. This is the Tyson Center in Missouri. This is a house where you see they say certified petal. It means that they've achieved certain of the petals, but not all of them. So they get a diminished rating. So it's not a waste of time doing this. I mean, we could get the bridesmaid, but wow. Another one, that's the Hawaii project. And so those 4, and there's one other, 5 have been completed, and 4 of them are fully certified. So 4 fully certified projects are where this thing stands right now. Okay, I got to flick through. So now we have a few more that are occupied. I think this might be the one that's now certified, but there's some that are occupied. This one is certified. I thought, wow, that's interesting. There's one in Australia. Maybe I should go home after all. This is ours here. Frankly, quite surprised. Pity that Charlie's not in the audience. But we're up there. This is the spread of projects that are underway. But with 4 completed and maybe another 4 that have been occupied. This was uploaded in August, so it's only 2 months out of date. It means that there's not a lot of demonstrated accomplishment yet. Reminds me of co-housing, because I was very much involved in the co-housing from the very early beginnings, before any of it existed here, and I was talking at length in 89, 90, 91, 92, or around the Northeast and beyond, about co-housing. And then around 91, 92, projects started arriving. There was one in Davis, another in Bainbridge Island, one in just outside of Boulder. And it became really exciting that there were actual completed projects, and it had a galvanizing effect on the movement, and I expect the same will be true with this. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'd be delighted to have any conversation that you have, and I'll try and answer questions circumscribed by my introduction, which is I don't know everything, but I do know some things about what it feels like to be at mile 6. Thank you very much.
I don't feel like I'm an asterisk kind of person. I want to, and I think that I would feel that the college might be the same. I think that people would probably like to say, we did it. Not we did it almost. But yes, they do allow certification apparently pedal by pedal, and there's one instance of that. I mean, I don't know how many pedals were certified. I think the reason for that was that they were the very first, and they got into the program after they had begun design or maybe construction. So this was an accommodation that got something into the program early. So it may be a short-lived thing, I don't know. Yes?
If no one answers your online question, how are you going to incorporate it by review?
Well, the question was, if no one answers my online question, or even if they do, how am I going to incorporate biophilia into this project? What's my sense of it? Well, they have 6 categories. It comes from Stephen Kellett's book. I think, I can't remember the name of it, Value and Life are in the title. But I like to put trees in buildings. We take the tree and we use it for support, and then we keep the branches, and you can do things with the stumps and the roots and so forth as well. It's a very organic feeling thing. My sense is that that's a strategy. I was talking to the professor, one of the geologists at Smith, and I said, could you provide me with half a dozen or a dozen rocks from the region and with their ages? And could you also cut them so that they were maybe about, not huge, but not tiny, something about that big, and cut them and then make them no more than 2 inches thick, and we'll put them in the floor, in the concrete floor. This is the concrete floor that we are polishing. It's relatively common these days with this sodium silicate densifier. And we'll put them on an axis that will be proportional to their age. And so the oldest rocks will be at the door, and the newest rocks will be up there somewhere. And so that, John Brady's going to do that for me. We have a mechanism. We think we had a meeting with all of the constructors, the polisher, the batch plant guy, and the concrete, how we can do that. And then I asked the students at Smith in one of the design classes, or through Jim Middleton, whether they could do some legwork there and find out. And Jim's students came up with a couple of ideas which I rather like. One that occurs that I remember particularly was that they would have a sundial with a place to stand, and you would be the gnomon. And I don't know whether, because I've seen sundials and the gnomons are usually curved in some way, so I don't know whether you have to be drunk or what have you, but they can figure that out. So that would be another, and so that's 3. I guess we have a trellis in the building that's shafts and shadows. I think that I like having sun into buildings, particularly if it's not going to distract the functionality. Sometimes in offices, for example, you don't want to have beam sunlight shafting across computer screens and so forth, but that's not the case in this building. So I think having sun shadow shafting through the space, that's another. So those are the kind of things that I'm thinking of at the moment. Do you have any suggestions? I mean, has anybody got anything that I should put a card out? Please tell me. So that's where I am at the moment anyway.
A couple of questions. The first is most of the projects are in areas like the project you're doing. They're not in urban areas, so I'm really interested to see that Seattle project. So going through this process itself, what do you imagine will be some different challenges for an urban project and for a more rural project?
That's a hard question to answer because I haven't thought about it very much. It's taking me out of my race and asking me to comment on a bike race, that I'm not in, and I don't cycle. So just to keep my metaphor on stretches a little bit here. So in principle, I think that the living building should be better exemplified in urban centres or settings, because we're seeing all sorts of analyses that show us why our footprints can be lesser in dense settings. And so I think that you'll be better able to engage. I think you might engage fewer of the exceptions, or you might make a more meaningful contribution to more of the imperatives. Some of those imperatives for us are, I guess, not very taxing. So I think it would be appropriate to be taxed by all of them, but I think they're all relevant and appropriate, and it would be nice to be, my diagram where I had some big bubbles and some little bubbles. It'd be nice if they were all the same size.
Well, I sort of
Yeah,
wanted
go.
to ask a question about that diagram, actually.
Yeah.
And maybe it's covered under, I love your category of design team tenacity. So I'm wondering if that really translates into schedule of a project like this, where there's so much research, so much pushing against the system. Would that diagram roughly correspond to increases in the schedule, or that would have to be a totally different diagram?
I think that the biggest thing I can say on that, and as I've already said it, but I'll repeat it and maybe expand a little if you like, is that living building projects ought to be executed as with construction management contracts. The fact that I had to spend time doing a more thorough and arm's length documentation and then conduct a bid process that went 4 weeks, and then we had another week or two to get the contract. So that meant that that there was a lot of time and effort that was involved. Now we could have back in reasonably in March or April of this year connected with the constructor that we have now. Yeah, in fact, we did, because we needed some help in organizing the costing of this. And Escapes bravely and magnificently said, yeah, we'll take an honorarium. I guess that would be the most polite way of describing the fee, to do this work. And I should say that rights were also asked for various reasons, but Escapes persisted through. So they had a role. Now, if we had have had from April, let's say, until September, when the letter of intent was executed, if I had have been able to talk to those guys, the scheduling would have been very different. We would have uncovered things. Right now, I'm doing a lot of vetting at the same time as the submittals are coming in. It's quite difficult, and I think if I were to do this talk 2 months from now, I might have a real, I might have a lot to say about lighting, for example, because when you're specifying lighting, you're really trying to, these days anyway, understand how you can move your products into the LED world. And there's a lot of design pieces. And then when you have to fold into that, where are these things made? Well, large components of them are made in China. That's a problem. There are things in there, mercury and so forth in lighting that you're trying to get.
Everyone else, that base.
Where's it saying that that in a building process, as you move from the conceptual design and it grows, and particularly after the construction begins, the cast of characters involved widens hugely, and all of those people are touched, and indeed need to be touched. That's the point of this whole exercise, for us to have conversations with these people to affect them, for them to affect us. It's a two-way street.
it's time-consuming, and it's difficult if it's all compressed into one piece. The scheduled piece needs to be done in a kind of a rhythm that allows you to spread it over the longest part of the process and to be deliberative about it, because you're doing certain things, you're making certain decisions here that you might not ordinarily make because there are a few extra factors involved. So some products that we specify might not be the ones we'd ordinarily do, and you'd like to be able to be a little deliberative about that before you say, oh my God. For example, we are probably going to have to, we may have to use a different damp-proofing material than the one we vetted, because things are taking a little longer and we're getting into a freezing situation. So what was a good product last week might not be a good product for us next week. We've got those factors to deal with. If we had a deliberative process, we might have been able to have two as a contingency and a fallback. We didn't do that. We didn't have time. So that's getting and folding everybody, huge cast of characters in to the consciousness raising on materials would have been better done over a period. Any more, or are we done here? There's one at the back.
As far as
last question, I think.
As far as the limits to growth, you were saying that given that it's a pretty green field, you managed to step around that because it's an educational setting, or how did you get around that? Not doing a brown or very great.
There is an exception. I can't remember whether they call it an exception or an exemption. It's probably an exception, actually, I think about it, that is specifically targeted for the use that you described and I did. For buildings which are intended to be interpretive of a natural setting, for example, there's an exemption that allows the building to be in the place that it's interpreting, and the assumption is that there is less likely to be a grey or a brown field there. The Tyson Center built some of it on an old parking lot. We did too, to the extent that we retained the vehicular parking and pavement areas. We've extended for accessible parking. We had thought that, for example, we might be able to reduce that in this case. We're always trying to scale back and have the exemption be the littlest ask possible. I thought of that we could go to the access board and ask for a variance on access being 200 feet from the building to make it 400 feet from the building. The logic or the rationale there was going to be A, the nature of the place where it is, and B, if we could create 400 feet at 0 grade as opposed to 200 feet at 5% grade, because that's the maximum. So what we would proposing or thinking of proposing was a swap on gradient for distance, and that the net effort would be similar. That was my untutored notion. As it turned out, the disability services people at Smith didn't like that idea, and so we brought the parking further in. So we've done a little bit more impact than we had not intended, that I thought that we might be able to achieve. But that's the reason that we are expecting that we can build this building on a greenish field. As I said, it's not in a pasture either. I think this is where the auditor process, you know, that person comes and they look at all of our stuff and they decide whether or not we are an acceptable candidate for this exemption. I hope we are.
I know in Hawaii, the building code allows vernacular structure. Do you think vernacular structures such as that would be
Yes, he's told me about it. Oh, that's great. How's he doing? Is he in New York? Oh, he got a job there.
Yeah, that's what I took her to.
Yeah. Well, but from what I know about Parker, he needs to be challenged, focused.
But then there's other problems that I can see.
Well, yeah, which is a great thing to know, to get to know early on.
I think actually I know. So the other question I have for you,
Thank you for introducing yourself. Yeah, I like having him.
right. So our issue is that yesterday. But I don't want to question you. We could have a those things. Yes, currently that's the sad truth. He said that there's two. But instead I mean, are you just taking it back? This is a learning process.
Can you carry back? That's the real question.
So you thought you were going to keep your mind going. And created this which immediately we started altering right away, but that's the nature of it. And then a lot of living as well as school districts sending kids to a high price facility. And that has changed. That's why the census. So the president and the CEO is really
Stuff that's growing as opposed to stuff. Big interior warehouse. Yeah.